Now, before we get into the specific content relating to this exam, I do want to talk about some basic Azure and cloud computing concepts. Now, if you have absolutely no understanding of Azure or cloud computing and you're watching this video for the first time, not really knowing much about cloud, then perhaps I can suggest there are deeper courses. I have an AZ 900 course that might be available on this platform if you can find it, that has to do with Azure fundamentals. Microsoft also has some great free materials at microsoft.com/learn. There's this 9 hours set of modules relating to Azure fundamentals. So if you really don't have any background in cloud computing at all, you might want to have that on the side to look into this. But I do want to spend about 10 minutes here talking about the basics of cloud computing and the basics of Microsoft Azure. Now, I look at Azure as sort of a three-legged stool where there's sort of three pillars that are fundamental to a lot of Azure solutions. One of them has to do with Azure virtual machines, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. We're also talking about app services, which are code that you can package up and send to the cloud. We'll talk about that. And the third leg of that stool is the storage technology, all of the files and CDNs and other things that are required to run your solution. So those are sort of three core Azure services. Now there's other services like machine learning and Azure Batch and other things that fall outside of this, but the core fundamentals are those three. Now, virtual machines are also sometimes called infrastructure as a service, and it's just as the name implies. It is a computer. It's either Windows or one of the Linux operating systems that you control. Now, it's not an actual physical machine that you can control the whole machine. There's a virtualization technology in a hypervisor that runs on top of that physical machine that splits up that physical machine into several dozen virtual machines, and you as a single owner of a single virtual machine can direct and control that. Now, it is, like I said, Windows or Linux OS. You do have the ability to remote desktop or SSH into that machine, and it looks, acts, and feels almost exactly like a physical machine running at your feet. Now, you can then install any software that you want. Okay, so if you want to have an IIS server running, if you want to put some files into a directory, that's all up to you. If you want it to be a file server, want it to be a database server, if you have a package of software from a third party that runs as an installer, you can upload that to your virtual machine and install that. And again, it looks and acts and feels just like a real server, but it's virtual. Now, virtual machines need to be on a network in order to be able to connect to the internet and connect to each other. And so when you create a virtual machine, you must define a virtual network for it. You have the option of putting these machines together in availability sets. And if you have to have multiple servers serving your content, you can have them behind load balancers, etc. It does take about 4 to 5 minutes to create a virtual machine. And so this is one of the great powers of cloud computing, is if you need a Windows server and you would love to have it within 20 or 30 minutes, go into Azure, fire up a virtual machine. You will have a Windows server that you can remote into and control within a few minutes. That is compared with having to install virtual machine technology on your own server, or having to purchase a new machine, installing the operating system on top of that, etc. So it's very quick. You pay by the minute, pay by the second actually within Microsoft Azure. And when you kill the machine, you stop paying for it. Those are the advantages of a virtual machine. It is the most analogous to what you're running currently within your own environment. When we move up the chain to another level of abstraction, there's app services. This is also sometimes called platform as a service. Microsoft provides Azure App Services, which can be web apps, mobile apps, API apps, and they even have a containerization option for app services. You can choose, again, Windows and Linux OS for your apps. These are fully managed servers, and you don't have the ability to remote desktop. You cannot go in and install third-party software. You cannot go install your own your code, other than packaging up your code and transferring your code as basically a zip file to Microsoft and for them to execute. Okay. It supports many different languages like .NET and Java and Ruby, but if it's not on the list, it's not supported. Now, there's a lot of benefits to doing this. When you get up that level of abstraction, Microsoft will take away some of the hassles of scaling, and you can use things like continuous integration where you have GitHub tied in with your web app, and as soon as there's a change to the code, that gets automatically deployed. There's the advantages of things like deployment slots where you can test your deployments before they go live. There's one-button integrations with Visual Studio where you just click publish and the code gets automatically deployed into an app service. And so there's a lot of advantages to using app services. They're sometimes also cheaper, but you do lose that level of control. So Microsoft takes over the operating system level where you can choose the operating system, but you can't update it. You can't install software. You don't have access to drives and remoting in and things like that. Now, the third leg of that stool is storage. Now, Microsoft in the last year or so has upped the storage capacity. You can now have up to 2 petabytes of a single storage account. And you can have hundreds of storage accounts, and you can have multiple subscriptions. And so if you really, really need storage, then you have almost unlimited storage available to you. Of course, you're going to have to pay for this. In the case of unmanaged storage, you're paying by the gigabyte. And so 2 petabytes, I think I did the math a while ago, but it's something like $50,000 a month in the current prices. So 2 petabytes is quite a lot. And it's larger than, the Library of Congress and larger than a lot of the information that you'll ever need to store. But if you're in that space, you can have these storage accounts. Outside of US and Europe, it's 500 terabytes is the limit. Now, Azure Storage provides you the ability to store stuff in the concept of blobs and containers. You can also use a queuing mechanism, which is basically first in, first out. It's allow applications to talk to each other using messages. There is a concept of tables, which is a type of data storage, not as robust as SQL Server or Azure SQL Database, and we'll talk about data in a second, but you can save a lot of money by using your Azure Storage account to store data. And finally, a full-on file system like it uses the SMB protocol, so you can share a file server with multiple servers, including multiple VMs, so that they can have the same source of files available to each other. Great for log files and outputs and things like that. Now, with storage accounts, Microsoft take care of replication for you. By default, you're going to get 3 copies of your files stored in the region. If you go up to global replication, you'll get 6 copies, and you can get your files stored even outside your region. So if any kind of disaster happens, those files don't get lost. Those files will get restored when that event is completed, etc. Microsoft's coming out with some preview programs for you to be able to trigger that failover to another region, as opposed to waiting for the failover to the region to restore itself. There's also the concept of storage tiers within the general purpose V2 storages, where you can have hot storage that's available immediately. That's the default kind. Or you can have cool storage, which saves you a lot of money on the storage fees, but costs you more in access charges. And finally, archive storage, which is almost analogous to a tape backup, where it does take some hours to get your files back, but that's the absolute cheapest form of storage. You can actually save 90% of your storage costs in an archive tier compared to the hot tier. But again, there is some hassle and expense in accessing those files. Great for backups and long-term storage. Finally, Azure Storage comes in different flavors. One is a managed storage, where Azure takes care of all this stuff for you. You don't need to set it up. It's managed storage. Or unmanaged, where it's just like a blobs, queues, tables, files, and you can do whatever you want with it, etc. Now, we alluded to databases a little while ago. Microsoft Azure has tons of database options, and there's more being added. Everything from a full-on SQL Server database that you can have as a managed service, or your own SQL Server in a VM. There's Azure SQL as a database as a service. Cosmos DB is global scale, very, very quick, sub 10 millisecond access times to Cosmos DB. You can put your backups in there in a recovery vault. MySQL, PostgreSQL, MariaDB. There's all sorts of different database technologies that Azure supports as a managed service, and even data warehouses for those really big needs. We're not even talking about big data, it's data lakes and things like that. Another paradigm for coding is these microservices where you have Azure functions. You can even code that within the browser, within the Azure portal. You don't even need a development environment to create functions. They're small, they're quick, they're cheap. You can tie them all together using a logic app, or you can define them using .NET, but create them into Service Fabric, etc. Many different microservices options that could save you even more money than app services, but it's even less control of the way that those things run compared to app services even. So it's another level of abstraction above that. Now, we talked about virtual machines. Those things need to be connected onto a network, and you obviously have to worry about security, how you're going to prevent intruders and allow authorized people, load balancers for traffic manager as a global service, virtual private networks, of course, if you want your private corporation to be connecting to Azure over a secure encrypted line and the general public to not have access, etc. So all of these services are point and click, available to you within minutes using the Azure portal, pay for it on your credit card, all that wonderful stuff. And literally, there are well over 1,000 services within the Azure Marketplace. And you've got everything from machine learning and various voice and video APIs and image APIs, chat bots. If you're running a live streaming, there's media services, Internet of Things, hubs, event queues, etc. All sorts of enterprise grade services for certain price and non-enterprise grade for cheaper price available within Azure. Now, I know that was extremely high level fly through of all of the different services available. But like I said, if you do want to get these fundamentals beyond the topics of this course, so we're going to go into these as they appear on the test. Like, for instance, there's no machine learning concepts within this exam. You're never going to see media services on this test, etc., and chatbots. But if you want to learn about those things, and Microsoft Learn's a great place, the Microsoft Docs, and check to see if I have courses. There's Azure Fundamentals and other courses available for that.